Perfect.
Okay.
Okay.
So let's go ahead and get started. The topic today is super important and in the news a lot, will be in the news for the next couple of years or more, and that's redistricting. In other words, a form of redistricting is gerrymandering, which is a topic that we've kind of made reference to from time to time. And our guest today is Peter Cannon, who spent 27 years with the Wisconsin Legislative Reference Bureau as an analyst. And I might point out that, or remind people that the Legislative Reference Bureau in Wisconsin is the equivalent to the legislative agency in Iowa that actually draws the maps and presents them to the Iowa legislature. So technically the legislature, like in Wisconsin, is responsible for redistricting, but the pattern has been to accept what the Iowa Legislative Reference Bureau presents to the legislature. So Terry, did you have anything further, or should we turn it over to Peter?
I think it's ready for that, and I'll be moderating some questions as you guys put them in, and either we'll interrupt you, Peter, as something really hot, or try to consolidate some at the end as it goes. So go right ahead, ready for it.
Okay, away we go.
Okay, good morning. What I'm going to try and do today is to give you kind of a structure in which to think about redistricting, why we do it, why it's difficult, and the existing rules. So why do we do it? Well, the Wisconsin Constitution says that we have to. At its first session after each enumeration made by the authority of the United States, the legislature shall apportion and district anew the members of the Senate and Assembly according to the number of inhabitants. Note, according to the number of inhabitants and shall. This is not something that they may do, it's something that they shall do. Hypothetically, if every piece of the state grew at exactly the same rate, you wouldn't have to reapportion. But of course, that's not what happens. On April 1st last year, we had a census, and surprise, surprise, the population grew. And it also shifts. So if you look at, these are estimates from the Wisconsin Department of Administration, which does running updates, estimates of population. Dane County is up 55,000 people, about 11%, where Marinette County is down 494 people, minus a little over 1%. The other thing happens is that municipalities annex territories, so municipal boundaries shift. And so, the results of all this is that we need to refigure everything. Why is it hard? I think a lot of people have the notion that, you just sort of sit down and make a few changes and everything's wonderful. But there are a huge number of important, to some people at least, interests involved. For example, is Milwaukee gonna lose an assembly seat this time around because their population growth has been slower? Can we get one more Black district? And also the party interests. Redistricting, as we know from gerrymandering, can change the balance of power in the legislature a lot. Individual legislators, you suddenly discover that you no longer live in your district, which is annoying. And we all have an interest. I think we don't think about this often, but name the senator, or the US congressman from the district to the south of Madison. Awful lot of us would have to struggle to do that. We pay attention to our legislators. And so we pay a lot more attention to what Mark Pocan does than to any of the other congressmen in the state. All of a sudden, if you're moved into a new congressional district, a new assembly district, all that knowledge that you'd accumulated, you've got to start over again. You might get a new polling place. It might be more convenient, but it might not be. And then, of course, I think citizens have an interest in seeing competitive races. There's not much fun if there's somebody running unopposed. And from a citizenship point of view, having a choice is always, I think, a better thing. And so all of these conflicting interests, and I'm going to go through some more as we go on, it's not the easiest thing in the world to do. Now, the results of that is that the legislature historically tended to not do it. And the second thing that you go into the past, in spite of saying that you redistrict, reapportion by the number of inhabitants, the legislature, and with the court's approval for a very long time, their basic unit for doing redistricting was counties. And so if you look at this map from the 1959 Blue Book, this is all counties or municipalities within counties. And so the 25th State Senate District is 3 whole counties. The 23rd is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 counties. County lines were extremely important up until 1970. And that has a number of advantages. If you look at this map, it's kind of a nice looking map. It's fairly compact. People recognize counties, and so it's easy to kind of orient yourself to what district you're in, that kind of thing. I'm going to zoom in here a little bit. This is the same map, but we're looking at the area around Dane County. The city of Madison was the 26th Senate District, and the rest of the county was 16. Jefferson and Waukesha were 1 district. The problem with that is that counties aren't equal in population. So in 1963, basically right after the census and looking at that map from 1959, 74,000 people in District 25 were 1 Senate seat. 208,000 people in Waukesha and Jefferson counties were 1 Senate seat. And so there's a huge amount of misrepresentation. The people in Douglas, Bayfield, and Ashland had a better say because there were fewer people elected 1 legislator. If you look at the counties or the assembly districts, it becomes maybe even worse. 19,000 people in Douglas County had 1 vote. 87,000 people in Waukesha County had 1 vote. So the most populous state assembly seat had more residents than the least populous state Senate seat. The Supreme Court, US Supreme Court, had really tried to stay out of what they called the thicket of redistricting because it's highly political and they just didn't want to get involved. But finally in the 60s, they decided that it had just become ridiculous. This, and believe it or not, Wisconsin is not even close to being the poster child for misrepresentation. There were several other states that were significantly worse. And so there were a string of US Supreme Court decisions in the 60s. This is Reynolds versus Sims, which is one of the key cases. Justice Warren writing the majority opinion, legislators represent people, not trees or acres. Legislators are elected by voters, not farms or cities or economic interest. the Equal Protection Clause demands no less than substantially equal state legislative representation for all citizens of all places, as well as of all races. This is the idea of one person, one vote. Now stop and think about this as we go through the rest of today. How would you characterize a perfect district? And what principles would you use to construct those districts? I would argue that there really isn't a single answer to that, but we'll see how it shakes out. According to the courts, this is what needs to be done. You have to be equal in population. And again, the one person, one vote, this is the deciding factor. You have to do this, and you have to do a pretty good job of it. You have to be in compliance with the Voting Rights Act. In other words, you can't disfranchise minority groups. Preservation of political subdivisions, in other words, representing county boundaries, city boundaries, is acceptable. It's a good thing. And compactness is a good thing. Community of interest is also a good thing. Districts should be contiguous. And it's good to preserve the core of prior districts, and it's okay to protect incumbents. In other words, there's nothing that says you cannot protect incumbents, according to the courts. There's also nothing that says you have to. But again, to go to this, the first thing, equal population, the overriding objective must be substantial equality of population among the various districts so that the vote of any citizen is approximately equal in weight to that of any other citizen in the state. Now, for congressional districts, the courts ask for mathematical equality. And Wisconsin's congressional districts, I forget the exact number there, 710,283, I think, would be an ideal congressional district. 6 of the 8 districts are exactly that. 2 districts are off by 1 person. That is difficult to do. And I would argue that attorneys need to maybe take a statistics course someplace along the line, because I think it's a moderately absurd standard. On the other hand, the nice thing about it is that it's easy to teach a computer. If you say it's got to be exactly equal, computers can do that really, really well. Wisconsin has also done a very, very good job. You've got more slack with state assembly and state senate districts, and even more slack with county supervisory districts and aldermanic districts. But this is, again, looking at the 2010 numbers. The ideal U.S. State Senate district is 172,333. And Senate District 18 is the furthest from that ideal number, 611 people off, which is 1/3%. And then again, looking at the assembly districts and going the other way, looking at the largest, they should be 57444. And the one that's furthest off is plus 205 people, again, about 1/3%. To some extent, the courts would probably have given the state a little more leeway than that. I mean, I think in other states, Senate and Assembly districts maybe run as much as 2 or 3% in either direction. I think Wisconsin, by doing a really good job of getting this number low, has handicapped themselves a little bit, because now that we've shown that we can do it, we sort of have to keep doing it. But we'll see. The second factor, racial and ethnic discrimination, that the minority group is sufficiently large and geographically compact to constitute a majority in a single member district. The group has to be politically cohesive. That is, it usually votes for the same candidates. And in the absence of special circumstances, block voting by the white majority usually defeats the minority's preferred candidate. This is a three-part test, and it's usually referred to as the Jingles test or something like that because it's Thornburg versus Jingles. If you think about it, what you get into, let's suppose you've got a district that's 50% black and 50% white, and half of the black people live in the east side of the district, or the black people all live in the east side of the district, white people all live in the west side. If you look at the results and the black candidate gets 55% of the vote in the white district, and the white candidate gets 55% of the vote in the black part of the district, then the black vote is not politically cohesive, and the white majority doesn't vote to defeat the black candidate. And so if there is a district like that, you really wouldn't have to worry about making sure that there were black majority districts so that blacks could elect candidates of their choice. There are some areas like that, but it's not the rule. The problem with political subdivisions is which ones? There's no real agreement that I've ever been able to see about whether you respect city boundaries, county boundaries, town boundaries, village boundaries. And there's no real way to measure which plan does a better job of it. So for example, I always use Janesville as an example of this. Janesville is a little too big to be one assembly district. So you have to do something with the part of Janesville that's left over after you do one assembly district. Or you could divide Janesville in half, but that leaves you a choice. Is it better to divide the towns around Janesville to make two districts for Janesville, or is it better to divide Janesville and leave the towns and villages whole? And almost the perfect example is the village of Cambridge, which is on the Jefferson-Dane County line. If you keep Cambridge whole, then you ignore the county boundary. If you keep the county whole, then you split Cambridge in half. Which one is better? There is no good answer. And this leads us to the how do you do redistricting with computers? Somebody has to program the computer. You have to give this computer a set of rules to use in making the boundaries. And you have to be able to measure, because computers do things with math, basically. And so, who chooses whether you keep cities whole or villages whole? And again, how do you decide which is better? All of a sudden, you have all these things that are fuzzy. Congressional districts are easy in the sense that the first criteria is how many people, and you have what attorneys call a bright line, zero deviation. Every time you introduce more fuzziness, do assembly districts, is it okay if they're 1/3%, or do they have to be closer than that, or is 2% okay? That makes it more difficult to measure which map is better, and therefore the computer is going to have a little more difficult time doing it. Compactness makes deciding whether to break municipalities seem like a really easy thing. This has become, I think, clearer over the last decade or so, but I was looking at an article written by a geographer in 2000, give or take, and he came up with, I think, 7 different ways to measure compactness. And he ended the article by saying that none of them are really very good. The problem you run into is that there aren't a lot of, once you get away from using county boundaries, there aren't a lot of nice squares in the political universe or in the geographic universe. For example, there's this thing called the Door Peninsula, and whatever assembly district includes the Door Peninsula is going to be less compact than anything else because you've got this thumb sticking up into Lake Michigan with a lot of shoreline. And so if you're measuring shoreline, shoreline really drives measures of compactness crazy because shorelines are not straight. They jiggle and jaggle and go here and there. You also run into problems because creating minority districts requires you not to do things that are square, as does observing municipal boundaries. This is a little hard to see, but the light blue is the southwest corner of the city of Madison. And if you look at this boundary, boy, that's not very regular. It goes in, it goes out, it goes up, it goes down. And so if you make the boundary of a district the city of Madison, it's not going to score as well on a compactness test as if the line were just the right side of this picture, straight north and south. Community of interest, we get even more fuzzy. Community of interest may be my best favorite thing because it is so fuzzy. It's the aggregation of people and groups who share some important characteristic that renders them unique, special, identifiable. Race is one such characteristic, so is ethnicity, religious affiliation, national background, language, economic status, means of earning a livelihood, are other characteristics that can demark a population as constituting a community of interest. My theory is that all of the Bears fans along the southern border with Illinois need to be in a separate district from other Wisconsinites because they represent a community of interest. And how do you decide which of these is religious affiliation more important than national background? We can't divide all those Swedes in Stoughton. But when I moved to Wisconsin, one of my friends explained to me that a Wisconsin town, Wisconsin village was a Irish Catholic church, a German Catholic church, a German Lutheran church, and a bar. And so, do you need to divide up the Lutherans and the Catholics? It's an important concept, and it can be useful, but it also is really, really difficult to decide what to do with it. Competition is what we would all, I think, like to see, and Matt is going to talk more about this, I'm sure, in 2 weeks. But right now, the controlling opinion is Runcho versus Common Cause just 2 years ago. And the U.S. Supreme Court held that although partisan gerrymandering is harmful and anti-democratic, it is a political issue that the federal courts lack the authority to address. I hope that that's going to go away. There was a time, I think I sort of alluded to, where the courts held that it was perfectly okay to divide the state into along county lines. And they've decided that that wasn't a good idea, that there were things that were more important. But right now, competition is not something that the courts will weigh in on. Doesn't mean you can't use it as a criteria, it just means the courts won't enforce it. Preservation of the core prior districts. I think that frequently that nobody wants to change the existing plan any more than they have to. I won't say no one, a lot of people don't want to. And again, as I suggested, if you really change the map, it's going to cause a lot of discomfort for a lot of citizens, because things are different. They have to learn new things. The courts particularly, I think, have had a tendency when the courts do the redistricting maps, I think more than the legislatures, they may choose to not change anything any more than they have to. Again, protection of incumbents is okay. The Iowa system, where my sister agency in Iowa does the maps, they are not allowed to look at incumbency. And so they routinely wind up with at least a couple of pairs of incumbents running against each other. And I think in 2010, with only 4 congressional districts, they managed to wind up with 2 congressmen running against each other. And this is one of the things that you run into in gerrymandering. Oddly enough, if the Democrats draw the lines, you find more Republicans running against each other than you do when the Republicans draw the lines. That's amazing. Probably just an accident. So again, if you look at all of these factors, I would argue that there is no perfect district. There are lots of districts which are constitutional, which are okay, but they're not perfect. Having said that, now I'm going to say that I lied, because the current gerrymandered map in Wisconsin is probably as perfect for the Republicans as they could make it. It is a fairly extreme gerrymander, and as a gerrymander, it is damn close to perfect. Gerrymandering. This is the original cartoon, editorial cartoon from 1812. This is part of the state of Massachusetts, where the Federalists drew a set of maps that were going to help the Federalist Party control state politics in Massachusetts. Someone suggested, and this is where the editorial cartoon came from, that the map looked like a salamander. The governor of Massachusetts was Elbridge Gerry. And someone says, it's not a salamander, it's a gerrymander. And that's where the term came from. This is probably not the first gerrymander, but it's the most famous. This is, according to a website called Statistica, is America's most gerrymandered current districts. Let's see, the Maryland district is around Baltimore. This 33rd Texas is Fort Worth. The 4th Texas is Austin. Louisiana, this district starts kind of at the bottom about Lake Pontchartrain, and it makes it all the way up to Baton Rouge. And Illinois is 4th, which has been kind of the same for several rounds of redistricting now. This is Lake Michigan right here, and the loop's kind of right here. And so this comes all the way out to the tri-state and then back in almost to the loop. I'm not sure about these other maps. This one, I have a feeling, is to try and dilute Austin's strength. But this one is arguably what's called a racial gerrymander. What this does, this is stitching together Hispanic populations. And when it was first done, it created the first Latino congressman in Illinois. And I think that this is mostly Black. And so what you do by doing this very weird shape is you create a Black majority district here and a Hispanic majority district here. And over the last decade or so, there have been more people who've suggested that a gerrymander done to provoke minority vote is still a gerrymander and should probably not be allowed. But again, this is one of the difficulties with all of these things is if it's a good enough reason, is it okay to gerrymander? So how do you gerrymander? Well, there are two major tactics that are used to gerrymander. One is what's called packing or stacking, and that means that you concentrate a minority group or a political party into the smallest area you can. And then the other side of that is fracturing. That's breaking off a portion of a minority group or political party into a district to which they are lost in a majority of another group. So in other words, you either dilute the vote by submerging it in another group, or you concentrate it. If you think about packing, you could take an area that's, let's pretend that Janesville is 100% Democratic. If you divide Janesville in half, you may be able to dilute, you can fracture that Democratic vote if everything around Janesville is 100% Republican, so that they don't, the Democrats can't elect a legislator from Janesville. Or the other side of it is that if you put all of Janesville in one district, that means that you can maybe win 2 seats in the surrounding area. Maybe the classic way of doing it is to treat the party or the group that you're interested in defeating and do it like a pie. Cut 5 slices out of it so that 1/5 of the people is in each pie slice, and therefore they get submerged. The thing that's kind of interesting about packing and that makes drawing maps difficult is that the Democratic Party today is a fairly urban. And to some extent, that means that Democrats pack themselves. And so if you let a computer draw maps without any particular rules at all, except keeping the population even, you're going to get maps that favor Republicans, because trying to do even population, fairly compact districts, it's easy to put lots of Democrats into one district more or less by accident. And so it complicates drawing maps, because the Democrats tend to be more densely populated in tighter areas. Okay, so where are we? Where are we going? What do we have to do here? The census was held last April and into the fall. The last state elections in the current districts were held in November. The last municipal elections in the old districts were held in April. I should have taken the question marks off of that because they were held. And then this minor little thing happened that messed things up. The census dragged on considerably longer than it usually does because of the pandemic. And as a result, all of the results of the census are dragging out. Congressional seats should have been apportioned by January 1st. So in other words, when 2 weeks ago we found out that Wisconsin continues to have 8 congressional seats, New York lost 1, Texas gained 2, etc. We should have known that on January 1st, not in April. And we actually should have gotten census data for the state of Wisconsin on about April 1st. Right now, they're talking about that data coming to us in August, maybe even September. The districts are supposed to be in place pretty soon. And the new congressional districts need to be in place by the spring of next year, because candidates can start circulating nominating papers on April 15th next year, and they have to be filed by June 1st. You can only sign nomination papers for a candidate in the district in which you live. How do you circulate nomination papers if you don't know where the district is? The primary for the congressional state legislative seats is August 9th next year. So we've really compressed the timeline. Municipalities need to create wards. Counties need to create supervisory districts. And I don't know what's going to happen with that. I really don't. Again, people are going to have to work a lot quicker than they did 10 years ago if to even come close to meeting those deadlines. Because the primary for the municipal elections is February 15. You can start circulating nomination papers for mayor, for county supervisor. I think in Madison, it's aldermanic districts are up this coming year. You can start circulating nomination papers, I think, December 1st. And if you only get the numbers in September, the cities are going to be really scrambling to get their wards done by December 1st. I wonder if either the legislature or a court challenge is going to change the dates for the municipal elections. I think it probably depends on exactly how late we get the data. I think that the state can still meet the deadlines for Senate and congressional districts, assembly districts. It may, the place where this may be the most difficult is in terms of public input. Because people are going to have less time to think about how the data has changed and to start, drawing maps. And the legislature is going to have an even bigger advantage than usual. And it's going to give, unfortunately, I think it may give the legislature an excuse to cut public participation even further. So go back to the question I asked before, now that you've seen all of these things, what's a perfect district? What principles would you use to construct a perfect district? And how would you rank those districts? And if you think about that and think about what I've said, you start to realize why this is not a particularly easy process. My former boss, Rupert Theobald, who has a little bronze plaque in the Assembly Chamber, he ran the Reference Bureau for about 30 years, said that the legislators should do redistricting because they know the districts better than pretty much anybody else. They were out walking the streets, collecting nomination papers, campaigning. I would argue that the problem is they proved untrustworthy in doing that job. But again, the having that local knowledge that gives you the expertise to know that it makes sense to put the line there rather than there is really, really difficult to come up with. I looked at a lot of maps over the years. Hold on just a second. I looked at a lot of maps over the years, and in some ways I may know the state as well as anybody, but I don't know it well enough. I'm not that familiar with the geography of Manitowoc County. And so how am I supposed to know? How is anybody in Madison, except people who live in Manitowoc County, going to know that it doesn't make sense to put the line there? And so, if you take anything away from this, recognize that leaving aside gerrymandering, leaving aside politics, it's still not easy to draw good maps because there are all of these things to consider and they compete with each other. And you may think that compactness is more important than I do. I may think community of interest is more important than you do. Okay, The wonderful thing, the thing that has changed in the last 10 years is that you can play now. In 1980, right after I started working at the Reference Bureau, redistricting was done by taking a paper map and putting it on a big table and putting a sheet of acetate on top of it and getting a marker and starting to draw lines. It took 3 analysts about a day to do the math on 99 assembly districts to see what the population totals were. In 1990, I was using very expensive computers, running very expensive custom software. The learning curve was pretty high. On the other hand, I could move a ward from one district to another and immediately see how it affected all the population totals. By 2000, the software was still expensive, but you could run it on any decent laptop. Today, you can go to this site, District R, and you can build your own map. There are a couple of other sites like this. I put this one up because the Governor's People's Map Commission is working with District R. And I encourage you to go out and look at this and maybe play around with it a little bit and get a feel for what's possible. But I think what this is going to do is it's going to let citizens, public interest groups do a much more effective job of coming up with competing maps when the legislature comes up with a really gerrymandered map. And specifically, this second internet address is the tool that the People's Map Commission is using to collect information about communities of interest. And I still spell communities wrong. Oh, well. The idea that the People's Map Commission came up with is, again, sort of what I was talking about, is local interest is how you know where to put the map. And so this would let you go in and define, don't worry about the whole state. Go in and say, this area right here, the northeast side of Madison, north of Northport Drive, is a community of interest. That's kind of another way of looking at it is Madison or Wisconsin up until 2010 used municipal wards as the building blocks for congressional legislative districts. And I always thought that made a lot of sense because, for example, in Madison, if you look at a map of the neighborhood associations and if you look at a map of Madison's wards, and neighborhood associations are one kind of community of interest. Madison's wards reflect the neighborhood associations pretty closely. And so, what you've done is you've institutionalized a certain kind of community of interest and made it a little easier for the legislature to know where it is. But this is a place where you can go in and, again, kind of get comfortable with what it looks like to be doing mapping with a computer, and also contribute some information to the People's Map Commission that hopefully will help them. The other kind of major place to go, the Wisconsin Democracy Campaign, I have to put in a plug for my group, but if you go to our website, there is a very thorough set of links to various sources of information about redistricting, gerrymandering, the reform groups that are out there. And previous iterations of this, I had, a page or so of sources, but everything that I wanted to include is on the page for the Democracy Campaign. And the People's Map Commission is trying to gather input. The website for the People's Map Commission, they had presentations in each of the 8 congressional districts. And the 3rd district presentation particularly had 2 mathematicians talking about using computers to make maps and evaluate them. And one is Jacob Erlinger, who's from the UW-Madison, who wrote a book called How Not to Be Wrong, How to Think Like a Mathematician. He writes incredibly well. And I think their presentation started about the 10-minute mark and go for maybe an hour from there. But if you want to get some idea of what some of the tools that mathematicians have come up with to evaluate maps and say, yes, this map is partisan or not, or gerrymandered or not. And also some of the things, does making a map that's perfectly compact, what does that do to competition? They've got some tools to help do that. So it's worth a look. It's very good. And that's basically what I have to say. What questions do you have?
Well, and want to recognize Matt Rothschild here with us too to say hi, Matt.
Hey, how are you?
Good. I'm going to toss a couple of things Peter's way, and Matt, you weigh in as you want to too, and Dennis, of course. Just what you mentioned, Peter. The first question was whether or not you could use a computer to make a district maximally competitive, and whether or not that actually, how competitive would it be due to demographics? So can you make a computer, can you ask it to really make it maximally competitive without knowing where everybody lives?
I think probably, but the kind of the sticker is define competitive. Does the district have to be 51-49? Is it okay for it to be 55-45? Because if you tell the computer to keep everything 49-51, you're going to get a different map than if you tell it to make it 45-55. And the other problem you have is that, again, the Democrats tend to pack themselves. And so you actually, I think, if I were doing it probably, and Matt may have a very different notion than I do, is that you're probably right now using the math from Jordan Ellensburg and people like that. Wisconsin's 8 congressional districts, only one of them is competitive. The third over along the Mississippi, La Crosse. I think what I would try and do is to get maybe 3, maybe 4 in a perfect world that were competitive, but that's still going to leave 4, maybe 5 that are not competitive. And again, the trick is simply where are the votes, and can you, again, if you make them perfectly competitive, I think you're going to wind up with some maps that look like that set of most gerrymandered that I show you. Because what you're going to have to do is take Madison and run 4, 5, 6 districts from the center of Madison out into to pick up enough Republican votes to make them competitive. And so it ain't going to look pretty.
Wow. So the third is the only one that Ron Kynes, the only one you think is truly competitive.
That's what the mathematicians say.
And he only won by 2% last time. So,
wow. And he's already got challenges coming up right now again. So interesting.
There's another perspective that needs to be brought in here too, and that is the focus has been on each district, and is it competitive or not, and meet the other kind of criteria. But a major concern and yardstick, if you will, is what about the state as a whole? I mean, it's sort of suspicious, or beyond suspicious, that we have statewide elections that are won by Democrats or closely won by Republicans or Democrats. But when you take a look at the composition of the legislature is overwhelmingly in the control of the Republicans. And so that's beyond I mean, the kind of criteria that you presented shows us the complexity of looking at it district by district. But then there's also the overall perspective of, gee, you know, we can't have a situation where by one criteria, the state is 50% Republican, 50% Democrat, and the legislature is controlled 2/3 by the Republicans. That doesn't compute.
You want to take that, Pete?
And you know, the mathematicians, if you go to the third district presentation that I just mentioned, you know, what the mathematicians do, this is, I think, developed out of all of the various sports things online. The sports people started doing, you know, they take all the numbers they can on the two teams in the Super Bowl, and they run the numbers 1,000 times. And they say Tampa Bay, you know, and the simulations won the Super Bowl, you know, 60 or 63% of the time. And so, you know, they're probably going to win it. And so what they do is they run what are called ensembles, and they'll run 100,000 iterations. And if you run 100,000 maps of Wisconsin using the 2010 data, again, because the Democratic vote packs, you know, without doing anything to change the rules, you tend to wind up with a Republican majority in the legislature in most of the cases. I think it was something like 54 seats. 63, if you look at a bell curve, 63 is way out here. You know, it's off the charts.
I mean, I think what the question Dennis raises gets you to the limits of the effort to ban gerrymandering. Because if we just ban gerrymandering and don't let what happened in 2011 happen this time around, the maps will be better and fairer, but they're not going to be drastically better and fairer because of the self-packing that Pete's talking about in Dane County and Milwaukee County largely. But then the question is, what's the remedy for that? And is the remedy to gerrymander in favor of Democrats, to you know, tilt the map so that everything is fairer or the Democrats have a better shake? Or are there other remedies to look at, like multi-member districts? Because you know, that would get to an answer as well. It's a really tricky thing when you start taking into consideration political demographic data. And I see that the People's Maps Commission has allowed itself to do that with one criterion being political fairness after it does compactness and contiguousness and communities of interest. Because if I'm a skeptic, if I'm Robin Voss, I'm going to say that's just, you know, that's just a pretty thin fig leaf for gerrymandering in favor of Democrats. And he might say the same thing about community of interest too. That's just camouflage for Democratic gerrymandering. So then you say, well, then you can play a semantic game and say, well, it's not really gerrymandering. What we're after here is fairness and a fair map, and it's not right in a state that is 50-50 that you have, you know, 63% of the legislature as Republican. So, you know, then you get to what's the least worst alternative. And if you say, well, we're going to change the maps to make them fair, and we're going to take some members on the isthmus and send them down to Walworth County and put them all together so you can get a fair district there. Well, you know, it's a weird looking map. But so I'm actually torn on this very question that Dennis raises.
I think
just to point to kind of give a historical kind of perspective on this. And you mentioned the Reynolds v. Sims court case, and there was the Baker versus Carr that occurred at the same time. And the concern that was raised in those was not just the number of people comparing one district to another, but it was a history of rural domination in state legislatures. And so the urban interests were just not being represented in terms of policymaking, budgets, anything that the states were doing. And the court was alarmed and said that it was alarmed that there was this rural overrepresentation, which was just not just numbers, but it had policy implications. And I think that's the parallel to that we face today, is that, you know, we have a two-party state when it comes to statewide elections. We have a one-party state when it comes to the legislature.
And that was one of the any number of the really poorly districted states. Florida, I think if I remember correctly, is like 37% of the rural part of Florida controlled the state legislature. And again, it wasn't partisan, it was urban rural. And that was what made it so hard to change, because I mean, that 37% of the people in the rural part of the state had absolutely no desire to give power to Milwaukee and Wisconsin or to Miami and Florida. It seems to me that maybe the solution is to try and come up with hybrids. And so if my memory is correct, and the mathematicians say that you know, kind of a off the shelf population-oriented map is going to give the Republicans maybe 54 seats. That maybe what you do is say that we will accept a certain amount of gerrymandering to get that number down to 51 seats or 50 seats. So, you know, in other words, you say, we're not going to go with something that really is, you know, we're not going to run a district from Madison to Prairie du Chien. But we're going to let it run a little bit further out into the countryside than we might otherwise do. And maybe the way to look at it is, again, to come back to the notion of competitiveness. And again, maybe, you know, you actually pack the Democrats a little more than they do automatically, so that you can create a handful of competitive districts that will allow the Democrats, if they run good candidates, to get down to 50-50. And you know, one of the problems with these incredibly one-party districts is that it doesn't make any difference how good a candidate the other party runs. I mean, they can run, you know, what on paper looks like the most spectacular candidate who has ever run for election, and they still only get 40% of the vote. They got 15% more of the vote than the last Democrat to run or the last Republican, but they still get waxed.
There's a question along those lines about sort of what you're saying, Matt, about does the Iowa blind apportionment work better or simply divide the pain?
Well, I think it's certainly cleaner than what we have. I mean, what we had in 2011 was, you know, they were looking for Democratic districts to fracture or to just totally hyper PAC. And by moving lines here and moving lines there, they created 9 different maps that were predicting increasing Republican majorities in the assembly without changing a single vote. It just changed the lines. And so that was as conscious a gerrymander as you're going to see, and effective and clever. And the Iowa model won't let you do that. And so just kind of as a first step toward getting rid of gerrymandering, the Iowa model would be an improvement. But it wouldn't solve the overall problem that Dennis was raising, and that the districts that are compact and contiguous in rural areas are predominantly Republican, and we have, you know, so many extra Democrats in Dane County and in Milwaukee County that Democrats are disadvantaged. There are also, you know, excess Republicans in Waukesha County, let's remember.
And it's interesting, the congressional, the kind of, because it was the districts when I moved to Wisconsin, sort of, I think of as the traditional makeup around Milwaukee. There was one district that was all Milwaukee, and there was one district that kind of was North Milwaukee out into Waukesha. And so, you know, the notion of extending a congressional district out into Waukesha has some historical standing. And it would obviously be more competitive than the way the districts are set up today.
One question is, could you please explain how the 7th Congressional District represented by progressive like Dave Obey for several decades, ends up electing uber conservatives. Is that redistricting? Is that what happened?
Partially, and Dennis maybe can weigh in better than I can on this, but it is, well, partly we lost a seat. Okay, Dave Obey represented that area when there were 9 seats. And so, the map was a little different simply because you were dividing the state into 9 pieces instead of 8. I think what that allowed was gerrymandering changed the shape of that district so that it included a lot more Republican territory. But I think also for reasons that I'm not good enough to even attempt to explain, I think the area has gotten somewhat less democratic than it was when Obey was there. And so I would suggest a combination of gerrymandering and a little change in the political landscape.
Yeah, Craig Gilbert at the Journal Sentinel has looked at some of these areas in Obey's old district and other conservative places outside of Madison and Milwaukee, especially north, and they've gotten a lot more conservative than they used to be by a big margin. So it is partially the different map, but it's also, people have moved over to the right in these places to a large extent.
I think that that one of the things that we have to remember is that the maps are an important factor, a key factor in terms of what we're talking about here. But there's also issues like campaign finance and issues that are indeed polarizing our country and our state in ways that we had not been polarized before, so that you had moderate Republicans, moderate Democrats who were appealing to the interests and the needs of various voters. You have less of that now with people have to take sides, and campaigns are financed by people who want to be majority leader or assembly speaker rather than by the people that they're representing.
And if I can just add on to that, Dennis, the campaign finance rewrite in 2015 by the Republicans gave the majority leader and the speaker just tremendous amounts of power with their legislative campaign committees, because people now could give unlimited amounts of money to the legislative campaign committees. Whereas, if you wanted to give $10,000 to Scott Walker, you could do that, but you could give unlimited amounts of money to the Assembly Democratic or Republican campaign committee. And so that made kingmakers even more than ever of the majority leader and the speaker, because they have essentially this slush fund right there where they can say to any wayward member, vote party line or we're going to primary you. And I got a stack of $100 bills here to throw in your face and you're going to lose. So what's more important to you, being in the assembly or being in the Senate or trying to be a hero on this one issue? Good luck. And that's what they do.
Yeah, good point.
There's a question about whether or not we could elect legislators at large, not by district. In other words, if 55% of voters were Dems, they could send 55 assembly members. Is that a good idea? Is it possible?
Well, I think you'd get to a fairer situation and you'd solve the problem that Dennis raised, that we have an unrepresentative legislature as far as the state goes. But then it also runs counter to the interest of having local community interests represented in the legislature. And so those things collide. And that's the problem. You get pulled and you get tugged here.
If you want your wild idea for the day, it occurred to me a number of years ago, the legislature, the assembly has a scoreboard in the chamber. And, when you push the button, there's one vote aye or one vote nay. It seems to me like it would be totally possible today to go back to everything as municipalities or even smaller chunks. But instead of the senator from the 26th getting one vote, since the city of Madison is actually this 1.72% of the state, that the senator from the 26th his vote would be 1.72. And the senator from Bayfield his vote would only be 0.9. So in other words, kind of reverse multi-member districts and instead, apportion the vote of the district to the population that the district held in the legislature.
Wow.
That is a wild idea.
But I think, the larger questions that this is getting to is what really is representative democracy? What is the best way? What is the fairest way to represent, to get representation in the legislature? And is it at the community level, or is it just to respond statewide? I mean, I have a colleague who says people don't even know what their districts are. It's ridiculous that we have districts. I bet 90% of the people in Wisconsin can't say what district they're in or who their assembly rep is.
My favorite story, this would have been 2001, 2002. This woman called the reference desk at the Reference Bureau, and she had just discovered that she had been moved out of her congressman's district. And she was incredibly upset because she had been moved out of Congressman Smith's district. And, I tried to explain, well, you got to do this because the population changed. She wasn't very happy, but we finally finished the conversation. And I started thinking about it. She'd been moved out of her congressman's district in the previous round of redistricting. And apparently hadn't noticed he wasn't on her ballot for a decade.
Wow.
The problem with multi-member districts is that they were a favorite tool of the segregationists in the South for quite a long time, because the easiest way to keep a minority from not having a vote is to make elect two people from an area which would normally have been two districts. And, the two districts together are 60% white, where, one of the districts is predominantly black. And so multi-member districts got into disfavor. I can't remember if the Supreme Court ever said you can't use them in the Title V part of the Voting Rights Act, but the courts were very suspicious of them. And I don't think multi-member districts are a bad idea, but I think we need to remind ourselves that they can have really bad impacts.
Someone asked you, Peter, and Matt, Dennis, you guys can all jump in. With all your principles that you made, would you rank what you thought were the most important from top to bottom, or at least your top three for the principles that you identified?
Well, you've got to do one person, one vote. The courts aren't going to let you get away with much on that, and I pretty much agree with that. You've got to do a good job on minority districts. I don't have a good rank for maybe the next three for compactness, for municipal boundaries. At least those two I would put sort of kind of co-equal. And again, recognizing people don't know what city they live in either. Back in the day, I ref City League basketball, and to play in City League, you had to be, it actually wasn't City League, it was Madison Municipal School District League. You had to live in the school district. And along the edges of the city, the number of people who had a clue what school district they lived in was close to zero. But I think, communities, cities, villages, towns are important to people. And so I think it is important to think about them. My absolute favorite thing from the 1990 round of redistricting is the town of Harmony in northern Rock County was in two different districts, and the village of Unity, which I think is up around Manitowoc someplace, was in two districts. And so Unity and Harmony were divided.
My grandparents grew up in defeated. One was from defeated Tennessee, and the other was from difficult Tennessee. when you get to those names. Matt, what do you think about that?
Well, I tend to agree with where Pete's coming from. I do want to start. I do think the map should start at the community level, at at local districts, and build up from there. I hate breaking up counties when you don't have to break up counties. I hate breaking up cities when the intention is to help the political party that's in power. But part of me thinks this whole idea of district representation is antiquated, and that we should get more of statewide representation somehow. Or people in the city should move to the country. I mean, that's the only other way that this problem gets solved. Because at the moment we have liberal Democrats packing into cities, and the rural areas becoming increasingly conservative. And so if you just ban gerrymandering, which is the Iowa model, really, it will, on the fairness level, might give Democrats 2 or 3 more seats, which we're going to get nowhere near the purple nature of the state. So that's the dilemma for me that I wrestle with.
And I think we need to move, we need to persuade the courts to move competitiveness into that list. We need to somehow consider that it simply is, whether you call it gerrymandering or competitiveness or whatever, we can't have a situation where a state that's roughly 50-50 has a 63 seat majority out of 50 in the assembly.
Well, Dennis, I believe you mentioned this before with one of the commissions we worked on, is that counties in Wisconsin had to be within a one-day horse ride to the county seat. Wasn't that how it was drawn up at some point?
Yeah, the towns. Yeah.
Yeah. So when you look at that and think about what Matt's asking, and one person asked, well, if we have 132 municipalities, why not have 132 assembly districts? I mean, maybe it's time to change some of these rules, things that were a one-day horse ride, for the capital, for the county seat. Some things maybe don't make sense anymore.
Yeah, well, if we're going to start thinking outside the box, I mean, number one, is that realistic to even spend a lot of time doing that? But if we're going to be doing that, then I agree with the comments about, maybe geographic districts are something that don't really work all that well anymore. They may not have worked all that well in the first place, but especially now. And there are democracies all over the world, especially in Europe, where geography is not really the main way in which you get in parliament. They have parliamentary lists, and among other things, it encourages more than 2 parties. You get much more subtlety in terms of policy making. So if we're going to get rid of what we've got now, I'd encourage people to think of that and think of ranked voting. A number of things we can do, still have a good, vibrant democracy, but recognize that there's some things that are not working really well.
Yeah, we could have proportional representation by party too.
Yep.
Dennis, didn't you once have also a discussion about having it be watersheds?
Yes, there was discussion. Gee, this was a couple decades ago. People were really seriously thinking about watersheds as the natural geographic boundaries that we could really use, and it would certainly enhance our attention to environmental issues. But even beyond that, I mean, watersheds really do, that talk about community of interest. That's a geographic way of having a foundation for that.
I always mentioned as this, this grail, I guess, within the state. Dennis, you're talking about other models, European and other places. Is there any other model that's doing a good job besides this always Iowa?
Well, there are a lot of states, and there's an increasing trend to a couple of things that play a role here. One is having consciously bipartisan commissions or nonpartisan commissions, and setting those up on a statewide basis, and some states that have moved to that, it's the commission that draws the maps. Others, it's the commission kind of that does what the Reference Bureau in Iowa does. They are the ones with all the prestige, kind of provide an influential map to go forward. The other is doing away with primaries or partisan primaries. I mean, California, for example, has done that. Louisiana did that historically as a way of keeping whites in power, but you can use models in Alaska, Washington, California, which take away some of these opportunities for kingmakers. We talked about those a little bit, a few minutes ago. It sort of decreases the opportunity for individuals who want to become Speaker of the Assembly to do the primary threat and primary people out. Reduces the role of party. And already Wisconsin is a state that's got a lot of laws that make parties weak. It's hard to have a political machine, but obviously you have a great deal of partisanship.
I think one thing that needs to be pointed out about the Iowa model is that at least at the congressional level, Iowa is pretty simple to do because there simply aren't enough minorities in Iowa to that second factor comes into play. The way Iowa does it is basically the people who work for the Legislative Services Bureau, whoever wants to kicks a map into the pile. And then everybody sits down and goes through the maps and decides which one's the best. And then that's what they present to the legislature. And the legislature can and occasionally has kicked the first map. The legislature doesn't have to adopt it. And then the Services Bureau comes back with the second map. The advantage to the system is that if everybody is playing the game right, it is as close to a nonpartisan model as you can come up with. My agency, regardless of the feeling of the individual people who work there, work really, really hard at being nonpartisan at work. And I think we were 99+% successful in doing that. Literally to the point where we did not put political bumper stickers on our car. We did not want any hint that what we did was partisan. And Iowa, it's the same kind of model. All the state nonpartisan agencies are that way. So you get as close to nonpartisan as you can get. The problem with the state commissions is that there are a lot of very, very bright people out there trying to game them. And so the question is are they succeeding? Have they set up a system which in practice is actually bipartisan or nonpartisan? And I don't know that we have enough of a baseline to really judge which of those is best. Do you have any idea, Dennis?
Yeah, that's a good point. I don't know that we do have any analysis, particularly since a lot of these are really relatively recent. So the number is not large enough to give us a real good sense of that.
Let me just add that
it's also, I think, important to note that, and this is in the vein of where do we go from here, that the states that have moved to that kind of a model or moved to something other than having the legislature set its own boundaries are states that have the referendum, and Wisconsin does not. So to count on the legislature saying, hey, yeah, we're going to give up this power and hand it over to either a legislative service agency or a commission. Yeah, in your dreams.
And the commission, the bipartisan commission, recent history isn't great here in Wisconsin. If you look what happened when they got rid of the Government Accountability Board and replaced it with the Wisconsin Elections Commission and Wisconsin Ethics Commission, which are hyper-partisan, titularly bipartisan organizations. They're split 3-3, but they're staffed by super partisan people on either side.
Unfortunately, that's a good point.
I know we're wrapping up here pretty close. Is there anything in the pipeline for the Supreme Court to reconsider the 1999 decision?
Not that I know of. The key was when Justice Kennedy left the bench.
Now, the other interesting thing that's floating around that we haven't touched on is you assume with a Democratic governor and a Republican legislature that whatever comes out of the legislature is going to be vetoed and we're going to go to court. And the question then becomes which court? Does it go to state court? Does it go to federal court? And the last 4 rounds have all gone to federal court. And in 2000, the state court sort of explicitly said, we're not going to get involved. 2010 was Republican majority, so it didn't go to court. But, that's going to be an interesting play, particularly since with the, I can't remember the name, the RUC, the competitiveness case.
Right.
Where the feds have said they're not going to get involved in gerrymandering. That doesn't mean a state court can't. On the other hand, the Wisconsin court may or may not be very partisan on something like this. I'm sort of guessing that the Republicans will file in state court as soon as they possibly can, because they're going to be more comfortable that the state court will rule in their favor than a federal 3-judge panel. If it goes to federal court, they usually go to a 3-judge panel. That gives you a much more even playing field in some respects. But that's something that's up in the air that will be interesting to watch.
Okay. Well, Dennis, I'm going to turn it back over to you. If anybody has last comments or questions or being optimistic or what we're going to talk about on the 18th.
We're going to talk with, we're going to pursue this topic, and our key speaker, our resource person is Matt Rothschild, who's going to be leading the discussion. So we're looking forward to that.
Me too.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you, Pete. Yeah,
thanks,
it's very
Peter.
good.
Fantastic, you guys. Appreciate it all. See you in a couple of weeks.
Right.
All right.
Take care.
Thank you.